This is how I'm able to publish 3 new pieces of content every weekday, while also running my business, traveling, and of course, catching up on my favorite TV shows too. But it definitely was not always this way. The crazy thing is, I'm actually not a natural creator. In fact, it used to take me 3 hours to write one newsletter, 1 hour to prepare for like a 10-minute video, and even longer than that to come up with an Instagram post. It wasn't until I discovered these 7 tips that I was able to start quickly and consistently creating content every day. Turns out, content creation is a skill, and if I can learn it, you absolutely can too. Let's start by addressing one of the biggest holdups for why it might be taking you a lot longer than you'd like to create your content. Does this sound familiar? You sit down at your computer and you think, all right, what can I talk about today? And you stare at that blank screen, waiting for inspiration to strike. Unfortunately, this can result in you waiting for a long time, which is why tip number 1 is to stop waiting for inspiration. Instead, take it. And if that sounds kind of forceful instead of like this dreamy, muse-filled experience, that's because it kind of is. It's like what author Elizabeth Gilbert says about inspiration. If you start, your ideas will meet you there. So now I take inspiration from literally anything and everything in my life. Literally nothing is too big or too small. To give you an example, one day I got obsessed about this new baking project. So I went out and I bought the molds that I needed. I was so excited about them, I took a picture and posted them on my Instagram stories to share fun behind the scenes of something I was doing. If I wanted to use that as inspiration for an email, I could share the story of how I got the mold and why I was interested in that baking project in the first place, and then tie that into a takeaway about trying new things in your business. Also, to get a little meta on you, I'm literally using that baking story right now as well as a teaching moment for this video. But if you still need help figuring out how to apply this to your life, I've got a super simple exercise for you. And to give credit where it's due, this is an exercise I learned from a great book about storytelling called Storyworthy. The idea is that at the end of every day, you spend just a few minutes thinking about all the things that happened to you that day that you could turn into a story. Then you jot them down in a spreadsheet.
You sit down, you reflect upon your day. You ask yourself, what is the most important moment of this day? If I had to stand on a TED stage and tell a 5-minute story, what would the moment be?
But you're not writing out the whole story. That would feel way too overwhelming. You're just jotting down a few pieces so that if you decide to make content out of it in the future, you've got enough to jog your memory. Over time, you'll naturally build up a huge bank of stories to ensure that whenever you sit down to create content, you always have plenty of inspiration. But once you have all those ideas, and remember this moment because one day you're gonna look back and realize, oh, whoa, Luisa was right. I do have a ton of stories and things to share. When you have that moment, give yourself a huge pat on the back, but also realize it's actually not just about the idea. Because the truth is, there's only so much that you can get from one piece of content. Only so many people will see it, and then the world will move on. But you deserve to get more than that out of each piece of content because you put in the work. That's why tip number 2 is to ask yourself, how can I turn that one idea into as many pieces of content as possible? This is something I learned to get really good at. I might share one angle in an email, condense it in a short, and then expand on it in a long form video like this one. This way, you will never run out of great ideas for your content. Plus, each piece of content will be better than the one before it because you'll be building up your experience on how to better communicate that idea to better connect with your audience. And this is especially important because if you're like me, you've probably found yourself working on a piece of content and wondering, what am I actually trying to say? But you've already spent so much time on writing the story or filming the video. That's why tip number 3 is crucial for making your content as simple as possible. And that is one piece of content, one takeaway. That's it. Ideally, you want to get clear on that one takeaway before you start creating your content. And the best way to do that is to ask yourself, what is the point I want to get across with this piece of content? For example, in this video you're watching, I wanted to make sure that you walk away with some great tips for creating great content in your business. That is the only goal of this video. Keeping that in mind helps me structure this video a lot better. And doing this for yourself will make it a lot easier and faster for you to create content, plus share more valuable content with your audience too. So high five to that. But that's not the only thing that can speed up your content creation process either. Once I discovered tip number 4, I started being able to create so much more quality content so much faster. And that tip is to not start from scratch with any piece of content that you create. Instead, I follow the same structure for every piece of content. Whether you're creating written or video content, the format doesn't really matter. It's going to go something like this. First, you start with an attention-grabbing hook. The point is to stop the scroll and get someone thinking, ooh, I might be interested in this. After your hook, follow up with what I call the meat. Essentially, what you need to share to communicate that one takeaway. You can do that by sharing a series of tips, like what I'm doing in this video, or illustrating via one story, or elaborating using one example. And as soon as you've delivered your takeaway, you want to wrap it up with a call to action, also known as a CTA, that directs your audience to do something with what they've just learned. Common CTAs are to check out your offer, go watch another piece of content that you've created, reach out to you if they're interested in hearing more about how you can help them, or just simply to think about what you've just shared. But honestly, as helpful as all of these tips are, if you're not actually making content, it's all irrelevant. Speaking from experience, it can be so easy to slip into that place of, what's the harm of missing just one day? One day won't make that big of a difference. But then one day becomes 2, which becomes 3. And then all of a sudden, this non-negotiable habit has become more of an afterthought. To prevent that from happening, change the question to, how can I make this process a little better and faster every day? And you don't even have to answer this question yourself. You can simply borrow the advice from some of the top writers in the world, like Stephen King, who requires himself to write 2,000 words every single day, even when he's on vacation. Or like Dan Kennedy, one of the top copywriters in the world, who first thing in the morning sits down at his desk and writes for at least an hour. Over the last few years, taking my lead from these two, I've developed that as a habit for myself as well. Before I do anything else, the first thing I do is create at least one piece of content. But even if you can't do it first thing in the morning right now, that is okay. The more important thing is to train yourself so that creating becomes as natural as brushing your teeth. That's why tip number 5 is to have some sort of set time and place where you can do your content creation every day. Now, to be clear though, I am not saying you have to make content for hours every day. In fact, exactly the opposite. Look, we keep it real around here, and the truth is nobody has time to be spending hours and hours on one piece of content. That's why tip number 6 is to give yourself a deadline. But don't worry, I'm not just dropping this tip without also telling you how to do it. So here's your game plan. Let's say you have to write an email. You are gonna set a timer for 45 minutes and write. Once those 45 minutes are up, that is it. You are done and you are sending it out. And by the way, I know this is scary. The first few times I did this, I would scramble to finish before the end of that 45-minute mark. In the very beginning, I'd even set a 5-minute warning timer so that I could use those last few minutes to wrap up whatever I was doing. It is not easy, but the only way to start getting faster and making progress is to be ruthless with yourself in this way. It might not feel good initially, but in case you needed to hear it, good enough is good enough. And honestly, it's a lot better to be good enough and done than perfect, but taking so long that you don't have time for anything else. But if you publish consistently, guess what? You'll get a lot better, and as a bonus, you'll get a lot faster too. There will come a day when you're able to shorten the length of that timer to 30 minutes or less. And just remember what I'm telling you now, because when that day comes, you are gonna be so glad that you started with those 45 minutes and good enough. But speaking of good enough, let me share my favorite tip for creating better and faster content a lot faster. If you're like me, you've been taught to write in kind of a cold, professional way. I used to write like that because that's all I knew. And honestly, it made me sound like a robot, which is not who I am or the type of big sister vibe I truly hope you feel. That's why tip number 7 is to create all your content out loud, as if you're talking to your best friend. You might look crazy, but it works wonders. And walk in my own talk, this is exactly how I scripted this video for you. This is one of the fastest shortcuts I've ever found for having your content come out naturally and sounding like you on the very first try. And while I swear by these practical tips for speeding up your content creation, I also know they won't really be able to land until you've shifted your mindset and thinking about content creation. That's why in this next video, I walk you through my top tips for how I've been able to consistently publish content every weekday for almost a decade. These 6 principles could transform your mindset and habits around content creation, so I will see you there.